jumping right into what I think is a truly fascinating mystery of both economics and history, Karl Marx's Capital, Volume 3. Now, whether you're an economics buff, a history enthusiast, or honestly just curious about how some of the most influential ideas in the modern world were actually put together, this text is an absolute puzzle box. We're going to unmask this incredibly dense book and break down its core arguments into clear, logical steps. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we've got the 10-year puzzle, then cost price versus true value, followed by the illusion of profit, the rate of profit, and finally, the math behind the mask.
All right, part 1, the 10-year puzzle and Friedrich Engels' monumental editing task.
So just take a look at this massive timeline. Marx actually drafted the core of Capital way back between 1863 and 1867, but he passed away in 1883. And while his close friend and collaborator, Friedrich Engels, managed to get Volume 2 published by 1885, Volume 3 didn't actually see the light of day until 1894. That is an immense gap of over 30 years from the initial drafting to its final publication.
Now, you might be wondering, what caused that agonizing delay? Well, it was all about the physical state of the manuscripts. As Engels wrote in the preface, the longer and more complex the sentences, in which thoughts were recorded in statu nascendi, in some places, handwriting and presentation betrayed all too clearly the outbreak and gradual progress of the attacks of ill health. You can really feel the empathy there, right? Engels had to painstakingly decipher this chaotic, unpolished mountain of notes that literally tracked his friend's declining health and physical toll over the years. It's wild to think about.
But hey, Engels didn't just spend that whole decade translating terrible handwriting. He also spent it fighting. Before he even gets to the math in his preface, Engels takes the time to absolutely roast rival economists who tried to solve Marx's economic puzzles prematurely. He calls Professor Lexis a Marxist disguised as a vulgar economist. He says Julius Wolff is groping in the dark with, quote, fathomless nonsense. He refers to Achille Laurier as an unprincipled upstart and a yelping pup, which is just brutal, and points out that George Stiebling built mountains of calculations upon basic mathematical errors. It is some highly entertaining, top-tier 19th century academic sass to kick things off. Moving right along to Section 2, Cost Price versus True Value, the fundamental contradiction in capitalist production. And this brilliantly illustrates the core contradiction Marx sets up right away in Chapter 1. We really have to look at production through a double lens here. On one side, we have the capitalist's view. To them, the cost of a commodity is simply the advanced capital. That's the direct, out-of-pocket money spent on materials, machinery, and wages. But on the flip side, we have Marx's definition of true value. For Marx, the true value of a commodity isn't just what it costs the capitalist to make. It's the cost price plus what he calls surplus value, which crucially includes the additional unpaid labor generated during the working day. Okay, let's define this strictly based on the source text. The cost price, which is represented mathematically by the letter K, is simply the portion of the commodity value that only replaces the price of consumed means of production and labor power. Basically, it's the strict out-of-pocket expense the capitalist pays. Mathematically, K equals C for constant capital, think machines and raw materials, plus V for variable capital, which represents wages.
To make this a bit more concrete, the text gives an example of 600 pounds. Imagine a commodity whose true value, based on the total labor time invested in it, is 600 pounds. But let's say it only cost the capitalist 500 pounds in materials and wages to actually produce it. That leaves a 100-pound difference. And that 100 pounds, that is the surplus.
Which actually leads us to a massive narrative cliffhanger. Think about it. If capital just replaces itself, if paying 500 pounds for materials and wages just puts 500 pounds of value into the product, where does that extra 100 pounds of value come from? How does value grow seemingly out of thin air? Keep that question in the back of your mind as we move forward. Okay, let's dive into this in part 3, the illusion of profit and how the origin of surplus value is obscured. So, Marx argues that surplus value springs specifically from living labor, the human effort that actually adds new value. But profit appears as the natural offspring of the entire advanced capital. You see, the capitalist lumps all their expenses together, machinery, cotton, coal, and human wages, and just looks at the final profit margin. By doing this, the unique, specific role that human labor plays in creating new value gets completely hidden from view. And you know, mainstream economic thought of the era totally reinforced this illusion. As the political economist Thomas Malthus is quoted in the text, the capitalist expects an equal profit upon all the parts of the capital which he advances. In other words, to the business owner, a dollar spent on a machine is expected to yield the exact same return as a dollar spent on human labor. It all just looks like one giant blob of capital magically expanding itself.
Which brings us to Section 4, the rate of profit, measuring surplus against the total investment.
So, the crucial point here is exactly how we measure success. The rate of profit, which we'll call P prime, is the ratio of the surplus value, S, to the total advanced capital, C. Expressed mathematically, it's P prime equals S over C. Notice what's happening here. We are measuring the surplus against the entire capital pie. The machines, the rent, the materials, the wages, all lumped together as a single letter C. We aren't just measuring it against the labor slice anymore.
The distinction Marx is making here is absolutely critical. The rate of surplus value measures the surplus S only against V, which is wages. In Marx's theory, this measures the specific degree of labor's exploitation. But the rate of profit measures that exact same surplus S against C, the total capital, measuring the degree of self-expansion of the total investment. There are literally two different mathematical measurements of the exact same pool of money, but they tell completely different stories.
Let's move to our final section and see how this builds. Section 5, the math behind the mask, covering Chapter 3's core algebraic formulas. Now please don't let the algebra intimidate you, because the logic here is actually quite elegant. Step 1, your total capital, C, is made up of constant capital plus variable capital. Step 2, the rate of surplus, S prime, equals S over V. Step 3, the rate of profit, P prime, equals S over total C. When we combine these in step 4, we get a master equation. In plain English, Marx is arguing that the profit rate is mathematically chained to the proportion of human labor inside your total investment.
Let's imagine a business where 80% is constant capital, stuff like machines and raw materials, and 20% is variable capital, which is the human labor. According to the mechanics we've just outlined, the machinery merely transfers its existing value as it wears down. Under this framework, it's only that 20% slice, the living human labor, that actively generates the new surplus value that puffs up the whole pie.
Because human labor is viewed here as the true engine of new value, real-world variables become mathematically critical. Changes in the working day, the intensity of labor, and wages simultaneously change the rate of profit. If a factory owner forces longer hours for the exact same pay, speeds up the assembly line, or slashes wages, they are directly manipulating these algebraic ratios to squeeze out a larger S, a larger surplus from that living labor slice. So the crucial point is, if we look at a few scenarios, this dynamic becomes incredibly clear. In a baseline scenario, let's say wages are 20 and surplus value is 20, which gives us a profit rate of 20%. Now, if wages are lowered to 12 without changing the working day, the surplus jumps to 28, and the profit rate leaps up to 30.4%. But if wages rise to 30, eating up all the newly created value, the surplus value drops to 0, and the profit rate drops to absolute 0. It perfectly illustrates Marx's central mathematical thesis: no unpaid labor, no profit. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. According to the text, profit is ultimately just a converted form of surplus value. It is the unpaid portion of human labor mathematically disguised as a natural return on investment. So I have to ask, does seeing the math behind the mask change how you view the price tag on everyday items? When you buy something tomorrow, will you just see the advanced capital, or will you see the hidden human labor? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking those great questions.